Just before Final Fantasy VII's release in early 1997, role-playing games were for a niche audience only. But after its enormous success, bringing JRPGs into the mainstream for the first time in Western territories, Square began working immediately on its next fantasy epic. Development on Final Fantasy VIII began in mid-1997. This time around, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi accepted his most hands-off role yet, being too busy with the direction of Square's first feature film to be involved in a significant way. While it was true that he hadn't directed a Final Fantasy game since V, he had been the creator of the original plots for VI and VII, and had closely supervised their development. In his absence, Shinji Hashimoto served as producer, and Sakaguchi's protege, Yoshinori Kitase, accepted both directing and plot creation responsibilities. He delegated scenario writing to Kazushige Nojima, who had both directed Bahamut Lagoon and helped Kitase with scenario writing on Final Fantasy VII. Hiroyuki Ito, who had directed Final Fantasy VI and created the active time battle system used in previous games, was brought on again to design the new battle system. Tetsuya Nomura, a young emerging talent within the company, was brought on for a second time as character designer, and worked closely with art director Yusuke Naura to create the most impressive and unique aesthetic for the series yet. And of course, as with every other game in the series, Nobuo Uematsu was once again brought on to write the music. With this newly appointed but impressively decorated team in place, it seemed Square was ready to fill Sakaguchi's shoes and move forward with the next installment in their flagship series. The real question, however, would be whether this contemporary team, many members of which had been brought up to take up veteran developers' places, could build a game that would both integrate their own original ideas and also maintain a spirit of tradition and faithfulness to the games that had come before. For the most part, I'd say they were successful in doing this, but I do think that the short turnaround for the game, which released only a year and a half after development began, hurt the potential of what were otherwise exceptional ideas across the board. One of the most substantial changes made to Final Fantasy VIII over previous iterations was its visual design. Characters of the previous games had been classically designed disproportionately, with large heads, small bodies, and exaggerated expressions. However, this time around, Yoshinori Kitase wanted to incorporate a more thematic look by combining fantasy with realism. In order to accomplish this, he aimed to create a cast of characters that looked and felt like real people. One way in which this was accomplished was through the use of motion capture technology during the full motion video sequences, making the character movements as lifelike as possible. I think it's also interesting to note that certain characters that Tetsuya Nomura had designed in the past were revived for Final Fantasy VIII, including Sorceress Idea, Fujin, and Raijin, the latter two having been discarded from Final Fantasy VII with the inclusion of the Turks. Art director Yusuke Naura once said in an interview that Final Fantasy VIII was meant to be a bright, fresh Final Fantasy, in contrast to the previous two games in the series. This change of direction can be seen commonly throughout the game, as Naura attempted to enhance the world through bright lighting and atmospheric shadow effects. Since most of the designers for the project had been involved with VI and VII, this change was welcomed by most, and as the series had proven capable many times in the past, Final Fantasy VIII became a vastly different experience from any Final Fantasy before it. As part of Kitase's vision for the project, Final Fantasy VIII's locations were heavily inspired by internationally familiar places, giving the game the desired foreign atmosphere. To strengthen this concept, the characters were also designed to look predominantly European. There's no doubt that the game has a very strong visual design. It looks leaps and bounds better than Final Fantasy VII, and I really like the proportioned look for the characters. When it comes to graphical spectacle, especially on the PS1, there weren't many games, if any, that could stand next to Final Fantasy VIII at the time it was released. Final Fantasy VIII tells the story of Squall Leonhardt, an introverted, aloof, but gifted student of a mercenary military academy called Balamb Garden. The Garden boasts an elite fighting force called Seed, which Squall and many of the other protagonists of the game are hoping to be inducted into. As the game begins, the player takes control of Squall on the day of a prerequisite mission before his final exam. The mission is a success, and during the graduation ceremony, Squall meets Final Fantasy VIII's other leading protagonist, Rinoa Heartily. The relationship between Squall and Rinoa is important to note because for the first time in the series, a romance took a predominant place in the overall narrative arc. Unfortunately, the developers didn't quite explore this relationship as deeply as I would have liked to have seen. But there are still some compelling scenes despite the fact that the stunted focus between the romance and the main plot can dilute its emotional impact. This subplot, like many features of this game, is polarizing for many players, and whether or not it resonates with you will depend entirely on your personal taste and experience. There are some who will relate immediately to the impulsive, alternating, and circular nature of many real-world romantic relationships, while others might find it dense and impassive. I think its effectiveness is sufficient enough when viewed under the correct perspective, though I find some of the other romantic subplots in the game to be far more compelling and subtle. Whether or not you end up enjoying it might actually be highly influenced by your opinion of the main character, which is again, a topic that divides a lot of fans in this series. I personally like Squall, and the entire cast of the game for that matter, despite the fact that there is a considerable lack of character development when compared to Final Fantasy VI and VII. Many people will criticize the game for this reason, and I can certainly understand that point of view, but I don't agree that a deep exploration of each character's personal backstory is a necessary or mandatory element to create a complementary ensemble. I like these characters because their distinctive personalities create a terrific balance between them, and the well-written dialogue, which proved to be the first truly excellent English localization effort in the series, really helps to make the party feel authentic. The way the characters play off of each other is both subtle and completely natural, and in my opinion, also incredibly entertaining. It's also important to keep in mind that this choice to avoid telling the backstories of the cast was done intentionally to supplement the main story. Without spoiling how this was done, and while I admittedly strongly disliked their reasons for doing so, it's nevertheless important to note that it was done for a reason. Excluding that notorious scene, a revelation which in my opinion feels contrived and adds nothing of substance to the story, I would say that the main plot is very well constructed. There were many ideas that were incredibly ambitious and innovative. For example, while most of the game takes place from Squall's perspective, there are many moments throughout where the player is taken out of that perspective to experience a completely different place and time, with a separate cast of characters whose involvement in the main plot differs tremendously from those of the main cast. This introduced a sense of mystery and curiosity about how these events would relate to the overall plot, and that alone kept me intrigued throughout the bulk of the experience. The pacing of the story is also done with excellent precision, unlike Final Fantasy VI and VII, which both had spots where the story began to drag for the sake of padding the game with extra content. Final Fantasy VIII's story never feels this way, with most scenes nailing both the appropriate tone and time spent on relevant exposition. It's not my favorite story in the series, but I do think it's undervalued by a lot of people. What it does well, it does to a level that parallels the best games in the series, but where it falters, it does so to a pretty substantial level, though the game's failures are not nearly as abundant as many would lead you to believe. I feel like this is at least partly due, as mentioned previously, to the game's short development cycle. With even just an extra year of development time, I think a lot of these wrinkles could have been smoothed out. This sentiment translates pretty well into how I feel about Final Fantasy VIII's battle mechanics and junctioning system as well. Again, the new ideas implemented here were solid, exceptional even, but in my opinion could have used more development time to reach their potential. Junctioning in particular is actually a fascinating game mechanic. The entire concept is centered on the use of summons, which are called Guardian Forces in this game. The idea behind junctioning Guardian Forces is actually pretty similar to assigning Espers in Final Fantasy VI or Materia in Final Fantasy VII, where abilities for the Junction Guardian Force are unlocked over time as the player earns AP in battle. Additionally, the player can also junction magic spells directly to the character's statistics, which act as a substitute for armor and accessories. Another interesting change comes in the form of weapon upgrading rather than buying and selling weapons at shops like in previous games. Each character in Final Fantasy VIII has a unique weapon that can be upgraded, and doing so affects the weapon's appearance, power, and limit break, which is actually a pretty interesting way of streamlining the inventory. One change I wasn't thrilled to see comes in how Final Fantasy VIII's limit break system works. Final Fantasy VII really got the system right, making limit breaks an important part of battles that could be used often and saved from one battle to the next. This game goes back to utilizing limit breaks similarly to how desperation attacks were used in 6. When a character is low on HP, or in other words, when a character is about to die, then limit breaks come into effect. These attacks do feature interactive elements that range from randomly selected spells to precise button input sequences, but in order to even see them, at least in the early game, you have to allow your characters to fall to a low percentage of their HP, which is something I make a point not to do when I play games, and I figure a lot of other people are the same way. There is a spell later in the game that allows limit breaks to come up more frequently regardless of your character's HP, but gathering and casting magic is a little unintuitive in this game as well. Unlike most games in the series, Final Fantasy VIII does not include a magic system that utilizes magic points. Instead, the player has to either draw spells from monsters and designated draw points, or refine items and cards into spells, which can be stored just like any other item. The draw system is pretty universally heralded as the most frustrating aspect of the game, because what it really amounts to is a lot of grinding. To be fair though, if the player utilizes refining efficiently, then there really isn't any need to draw spells at all, as any spell the player could ever need can be obtained through this process, which is both a quicker and a more efficient way of obtaining spells. My biggest problem with the junctioning system is not in how magic is obtained, but rather in how it intrinsically promotes the minimal use of spell casting, because the character's stats are tied directly to the number of spells they have junctioned. In other words, the more spells you junction to a particular stat, the higher the boost to that stat is going to be. This means that by casting magic, you can in essence also slowly weaken your character. It doesn't make much of a difference if you use the spell 10 to 15 times before replenishing, but if you really rely on magic in battle, you can greatly decrease your character's stat bonuses. This of course is only an issue for the spells you actually have junctioned, and defenders of the system will point out that you could always just junction spells you don't plan on using in battle, but the answer isn't quite that simple for people who like to optimize their characters. Even if you do avoid junctioning spells that you want to use in battle, physical attacks tend to be far more effective than magic on the whole in dealing damage anyway, especially for those who do enjoy playing optimally. Because of this, gathering the most powerful spells you can find and junctioning them to your strength, vitality, and HP makes the battles really easy, to the point where most monsters can be easily destroyed by a single physical attack. This is possible not because the junctioning system is broken, or inherently flawed, or anything like that, but because junctioning is paired with an incompatible leveling system. In Final Fantasy VIII, enemies' levels around the world actually scale with Squall. In essence, the greater Squall's level is, the more powerful the enemies become. We've seen level scaling like this in other RPGs like the Elder Scrolls, but there's a reason why you don't typically find this kind of level scaling in turn-based RPGs like Final Fantasy. In the Elder Scrolls, your character levels up not only by engaging in battle, but also by increasing passive abilities such as sneaking, acrobatics, or speechcraft. In other words, you level up through many different kinds of interactions with the world, and by doing so, the power of the enemies around you continues to scale at a consistent rate. In turn-based RPGs, however, your party only levels up by engaging in battle and gaining experience points. What this means is that enemies only have one way to get stronger, and that is for the player to engage them in battle. However, due to the introduction of the junctioning system, there's more than one way for the player to get stronger. Since the character's statistics can be upgraded by junctioning more powerful spells, leveling up is no longer necessary, especially since you can keep the enemy's levels very low by avoiding battles. This makes it possible to shatter the game's difficulty with relative ease. For example, tents are available in the very first town of the game, and tents can be refined into 10 Curaga spells. Junctioning Curaga spells can take your character's HP from 400 to 3000 right at the very beginning of the game, which will essentially make you invincible for the first 2 discs. Now, there might be some people thinking, well, you don't have to junction Curaga at the beginning of the game, and you can choose not to overpower your characters. And for a lot of players who enjoy doing challenge runs, this game offers a lot of potential for you because of how customizable the difficulty can be depending on how you choose to level up and junction your characters. But as I've mentioned before, this kind of thing tends to polarize people. And for people like me who look for more of an organic challenge in the games we play, Final Fantasy VIII doesn't have much to offer. I enjoy games where I have to try my hardest to defeat enemies, using both my mastery of the game's mechanics and the best strategies I can devise to proceed through the game. If I play Final Fantasy VIII in this way, there's essentially no challenge at all, and unfortunately, Challenge runs don't tend to excite me very much because in the back of my mind, I always know that I could just play optimally and proceed with ease if I wanted to. For this reason, Final Fantasy VIII's battle mechanics don't really resonate with me, but for many players, these mechanics open up a wide variety of options, which can be very exciting depending on how you like to play. Again, I feel like with a little more time, the developers might have been able to find a way to make the game more appealing to those who enjoy playing optimally. When it comes to side content, however, Final Fantasy VIII has a lot to offer. Triple Triad, which is an optional card game that can be played with just about any NPC in the game's world, is actually a pretty brilliant minigame, and provides a lot of strategy and challenge that I missed in the game's battle mechanics. This is due to the fact that the rules of the game often change depending on which region of the world you're in, and let me tell you, some of these rules can make the game very difficult to win. The Queen of Cards side quest in general can be extremely grueling if you plan to attempt it without resetting the game. But if you don't, and if you want to try and abolish certain pesky rules throughout the world that you don't want to deal with, you'll find yourself doing more resetting than you ever did in the Chocobo breeding in Final Fantasy VII. Most of the side quests in the game provide pretty substantial rewards, but there are a few that don't offer much to make the effort worth it, which unfortunately is pretty common in this series. This game's one unblemished feature, however, is its musical score. For every criticism I've laid out thus far, I could easily forgive it all if only because Final Fantasy VIII's soundtrack is so magnificent. I can say without hesitation that this soundtrack is the very best in the series, and the finest work of Nobuo Uematsu's career. For this installment, Uematsu sought more than ever before to center the music on the emotional content of the game, and I, for one, can definitely feel that. He once said in an interview, "I think it will be a shame if we won't be able to cry as we play our own game." This is a pretty ambitious goal for a video game composer, especially considering the fact that he later said, "It's important to know when the character's emotions are at their height, but it usually takes until a month before the game is released to finish the ending dialogue." Because of this, Uematsu had to rely heavily on concept art in order to come to understand the emotions of the characters. One important departure he took from his earlier work was his decision not to write character themes. His reason for this is actually pretty surprising. According to Uematsu, character themes from the previous games were, quote, ineffective. I'm not sure I agree with him, but he's the genius, not me. He went on to say that it's reasonable to have character themes if each character has a highlight in the game, but he found that Final Fantasy VIII focused so much on Squall and Renoa's romance that he decided to focus on creating a theme for them instead. The result was Eyes on Me. Towards the end of Final Fantasy VII's development, many of the developers suggested using a popular singer for the main theme, but the idea was eventually abandoned due to the poor fit with the game's themes and storyline. However, for Final Fantasy VIII, Uematsu believed that a ballad would fit nicely with the love-centered themes of the game. Chinese pop singer Faye Wong was chosen to perform the piece, with Uematsu claiming that her voice and mood seemed to match his image of the song, and that her ethnicity fit the international image of Final Fantasy. The song as a single went on to sell 400,000 copies in Japan, setting the record for the highest-selling video game music disc ever released at that time. Another noteworthy piece to emerge from this soundtrack is Liberi Fatali. In English, it translates to Children of Fate, and it might be my favorite song in the series. It's fairly common to find fans who debate whether Dancing Mad or One Winged Angel is the best piece of music Uematsu has ever written. But in my opinion, Liberi Fatali beats them both by a country mile. Admittedly, this is partly due to the fact that it's the first fully orchestrated piece to be featured in a Final Fantasy game. But really, it's more than that. There's something about the way the song builds in its early stages, the power of its crescendos, the complexity and variance between its movements, the balance and harmony of its mix. It's just an absolutely masterful show of musical composition and pumps me up every time I hear it. It's so remarkable, in fact, that it was even selected to be played during the 2004 Summer Olympic Games in Athens. Final Fantasy VIII's entire soundtrack is incredibly impressive. There are so many pieces that to this day give me chills, especially Fisherman's Horizon. I love this song. Overall, Final Fantasy VIII is a fresh experience with a ton of exceptionally innovative ideas. It has a great cast of characters that are easy to get behind, and a well-constructed story that unfortunately fumbles a bit from time to time, though there really are some incredibly effective moments. It introduces an interesting junctioning system that boasts a lot of depth, but coupled with an incompatible level scaling system and card refining, it makes it a little too easy to break the game's difficulty and eliminates a lot of strategy from battles. There's a lot to love, but also a lot to criticize, which I feel is mostly due to the game's short development cycle. It's a game that polarizes a lot of players and creates some heated debates online, so whether or not you enjoy it will likely depend on your personal taste and experience. In my opinion, it's a solid entry to an amazing series that I have a lot of respect for precisely because of the fact that the developers tried to do something different. My final score for the game is 3.5 dancing chocobos out of 5.